afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday the 3rd of March. My name is Brian Liddy and I'm joined today by Fatima Joji, the SNP councillor for West Hill and District Aberdeen. Fatima, thank you for giving up a big chunk of your weekend to join us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back on.
And forgive me, did I mispronounce your name?
Yeah, it's Joji. So it's, Joji, Joji. Yeah.
Forgive me, Fatima.
Oh,
if you've watched the show before when I'm on, I've got a terrible reputation when it comes to people's names. So Fatima, I'm going to do our Ukraine update as usual, and then we'll get on with the rest of the show. President Zelensky, Ukraine update day 739. President Zelensky has called on the West to rapidly deliver more air defence systems as a wave of Russian missile, drone and artillery strikes killed at least 11 people. 8 were confirmed dead, including a child and a baby, after an overnight drone strike on an apartment block in the southern port city of Odessa. A regional official said, Zelensky said, we need more air defences from our partners. We need to strengthen the Ukrainian air shield to add more protection for our people from Russian terror. About 10 people were still unaccounted for after the Odessa strike on the 9-storey building, according to Interior Minister Igor Klimenko. Almost 100 rescuers were continuing to search and rescue operation overnight. Ukraine's armed forces said the Odessa region was attacked by 8 drones, of which 7 were shot down. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has promised a full investigation after a purported recording of confidential army talks on the Ukraine war was circulated on Russian social media in a huge embarrassment for Berlin. The German Defence Ministry believed a conversation in the Air Force division was intercepted, a ministry spokesperson said. The recording apparently showed German officials discussing striking Crimea and delivery of long-range missiles to Kyiv. Shelling attacks on the front line Kharkiv, Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions killed another 3 people, Ukrainian officials said. Mykola Oleshchuk, the Ukrainian Air Force commander, said that Ukraine had downed a Russian Su-34 fighter bomber on Saturday. A drone crashed into an apartment building in St. Petersburg in Russia, according to state news agency RIA Novosti, which said that 6 people had received medical help after an explosion on Saturday morning in the northwestern Russian city. Reports say that Russian artillery shelling killed a 53-year-old man in the partly occupied Kherson region on Saturday. The mother and mother-in-law of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny were among mourners who brought flowers to his grave in Moscow on Saturday, a day after thousands turned out for his funeral, turned his funeral into one of the largest recent displays of dissent in Russia. More than 20 settlements in Ukraine's eastern province of Kharkiv are reported to have sustained Russian artillery and mortar attacks. As well, high-rise buildings in Kharkiv city were damaged by a drone attack, the regional governor Oleh Syniabov was reported as saying. Fatima, was there anything in there that caught your eye or that you'd like to expand on?
No, I think just in general, I think we have to recognise in terms of the Ukraine crisis that this has been going on for a very long time. And I think it's really important that we have the Scottish Government in particular and the wider UK government ensuring that Ukraine nationals are supported in the UK, because just now we're seeing that the visa scheme, the 3-year visa scheme is temporary for Ukraine nationals, and they need to be able to see that they can settle in Scotland. A lot of them are contributing already to Scotland and they should be able to remain here because it's not safe.
Thank you, Fatima. So moving on to the situation in Palestine and Gaza, at least 30,410 Palestinians have been killed and 71,700 injured in Israeli strikes on Gaza since the 7th of October. As negotiations for a 6-week ceasefire move closer to agreement, Israeli strikes hit tents housing displaced Palestinians near a hospital in Rafah, killing 11 people and injuring dozens. So, Fatima, the question we have here today is postponing death and destruction for 6 weeks enough if there is going to be a pause or a ceasefire?
Absolutely not enough. And that's a direct answer to your question. The question you've just asked is postponing death and destruction for 6 weeks, you said, and then what? Just resume after 6 weeks? No, we cannot stop at just a temporary ceasefire. And I unequivocally support my SNP Westminster colleagues who have been calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and Israel since October. And, the release of all hostages. In addition to that, as we have seen in the latest Westminster SNP motion, there is a call for an end in arms sales to Israel, which I also agree with. We can't just stop at that. We also need to find our way to ensure that there's a two-state solution and an end to this crisis. These are lives we're talking about. The statistics you have just mentioned are horrific, they're horrifying, and they're climbing. We cannot just see a pause and then a resumption. That is morally wrong on every level. And I don't understand how many can be okay with that. And even the wider British public have spoken, because we've also seen a YouGov poll has found that 71% of Britons are in favour of an immediate ceasefire. And it's time Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak listen to the electorate and join the international community who are calling for peace and a two-state solution. If we just look at what's happened, the events of the past few weeks and months as well, we've seen the UK abstain on UN votes demanding a ceasefire in Gaza. It's a complete and utter abdication of leadership. And I would have to say to the Westminster leadership, show that leadership, like the SNP are doing, an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages, an end of arms sales to Gaza, an end of arms sales to Israel, and also ensure that there is a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. We need to be able to support peace. We need to listen to people who are calling for peace, which a majority of people want. More people do not need to die.
Thank you, Fatima. I was tempted to bring in Rishi Sunak's speech on the steps of 10 Downing Street the other night, but we'll be talking about that later on, so I'll save it. But can I maybe just ask you, you mentioned your colleagues in Westminster, your SNP colleagues in Westminster. Do you have any news or any updates on their request for a new debate on a ceasefire and their hopes to compel the UK to vote for a ceasefire in the UN? Have you got any gossip for us or any updates?
I don't have any gossip, but everything that we're calling for, we're being very transparent, is all in the public domain. And as we can see from Stephen Flynn, he has been very vocal and steadfast as a leader in consistently calling for a ceasefire. We're not going to give up on pushing this motion through, because at the end of the day, we're thinking about lives. We're seeing those numbers rising. So we're never going to stop calling for an immediate ceasefire. If all the shenanigans that we have seen that's happened in this past week in Westminster, that's not going to put an end to our calls for a ceasefire. The motion still remains. As you see, we're updating the motion as it goes, because when we started, the motion did not include an end in arms sales to Israel. Now that has been included. It just goes to show that, if anything, we're more vocal, we're making better demands as the situation changes as well. So I think that just indicates that we are on a particular path, which is to ensure that there's peace, and that there's a two-state solution, and that there's an immediate ceasefire. And that call, that strong, vocal, steadfast, unequivocal call, is never going to go away.
Thank you, Fatima. I've got a press release here which says that the majority of Scots think that Sunak and Starmer have handled Gaza badly. Sunak and Starmer must back concrete actions to secure lasting peace. Do you think, what are the chances of that happening? I'll stop mumbling and let you reply.
Well, I think if you look at the pattern of their behaviour, the chances of that we are recognising are not very high, but that does not mean that we cannot keep putting pressure on them to change. Because if you think about the stance at the beginning of this crisis, at the beginning in October, they were very clear in basically giving Israel the green light to do whatever they want. And I've realised that they are actually being a bit more careful and now recognising, okay, they've started moving towards recognising the issue of a ceasefire. But even though they're their motions are very weak in substance as well. So really just means that we have to keep calling and pushing for this ceasefire to happen, because what we do recognize is that whilst the chances of them actually doing that, because let's be real, their policies and what they actually want to achieve is not really transparent. It's also quite questionable as well, and what they're supporting and what they're not supporting. So whether they support an immediate ceasefire, because I think the rhetoric coming from them, I find that they don't see the lives of Gazans as equal. There seems to be a hierarchy of racism within Labour and the Tories as well. So we are just going to keep pushing, even though that the chances might seem slim, but we need to get somewhere. And that includes that we keep being steadfast in our approach.
Thank you, Fatima. So that it wasn't a quote. That when I said that the majority of Scots think that Sunak and Starmer have handled Gaza badly, it's from a YouGov poll earlier this week, and it said they polled 2,073 adults in Britain, and it revealed that 6 in 10 people in Scotland think Sunak and Starmer have handled the UK's response badly, compared to just 1 in 10 who think they've handled it well. Do you think there's a difference between Scotland and England when it comes to the situation in Palestine? I'm looking for the figures for England, but it says across Britain, 4 in 10 people think Sunak and Starmer have handled the UK's response badly, compared to 3 in 10 who think Sunak handled it well, and 2 in 10 who, again, there's no mention of Scotland there. I've 6 in 10 in Scotland. You can probably hear the voice in your ear as well as me, Fatima. So 6 in 10 in Scotland think they've handled it badly, as opposed to more people think that they've handled it better in England than they do in Scotland, basically. Why do you think that might be?
But if you think of this, I'm just listening to the statistics that you just gave as well. It is a very low number that think they've handled it well, both in England and Scotland. And the number of people who think they've handled it badly still remains consistently higher in both England and Scotland than those who actually support what they've done. So, and the wider YouGov poll that we saw that was released in January, 71% of the wider UK, it just consistently shows that the number of people who want the peace, who want the ceasefire, is still more than those who think that Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer, that their responses have been great at all. So it remains that that their actions are at complete odds with what the British public, what the majority of the British public, what the majority of the Scottish public want. Yes, I think the statistics tell us that up in Scotland, it seems that we're actually pushing for more to be done in terms of a ceasefire. And that's consistent with the rhetoric that's coming out from our leadership. That's also consistent with the response that we're seeing on the ground in terms of marches. But equally, we're also seeing across England, the peaceful protests that are also calling for that. People are turning out in their millions to call for a peaceful protest. So I think we can look at these figures that you have just quoted and recognise that still a majority across the UK still want an immediate ceasefire. Less people think that they've actually done a good job in responding to this, and we're seeing more and more people think the way that Scotland does, right from the top of our leadership.
Thank you, Fatima. I'll move on to the next item, which is Gorgeous George is back. George Galloway has won the Rochdale by-election. George Galloway, who older viewers might remember as Gorgeous George, is now standing for the Workers' Party of Britain. That's the fourth, he's won in Rochdale, which is the fourth city that he's been represented in, and the Workers' Party for Britain is the third party that he's been in 4 decades. He beat both Tory and Labour, and will have to fight for the seat again later this year at the next general election, whenever that is. So he won 39.7% of the vote. The second place came another independent fellow called David Cully. He got 21%. He's new to politics, is a local mechanic business, and got second vote. Conservatives came third with 12%. That's down 22%. Labour, although Labour they disavowed themselves from their candidate, but it still had the Labour logo next to his name, so it kind of, if he had stood, he got 7.7%, which is down 48.4%. It seems that George was able to speak passionately to Asian and Muslim communities on the situation in Gaza. He had an anti-woke stand. He would have appealed to anybody who wants to see a ceasefire in Gaza. He mentioned Pakistani grooming gangs, and he seemed to understand the dynamics in Rochdale. Fatima, is there anything there that you'd like to expand on?
Yeah, I think starting from from Labour not getting any candidate in. I'm looking at Labour and I'm finding it quite interesting that they fail to recognise that the candidate still had the Labour logo on the ballot. A lot of people will go to the polling station and look for Labour and still vote because they won't know what's happening in the news or the wider. They just know to go and vote Labour anyway. So they want to somehow give the impression that that wasn't clear, that it wasn't there, that it wasn't Labour that people were looking at. So whether they like it or not, I think they need to recognise that their vote went down significantly and drastically. And I still feel that even if they didn't withdraw support for their Labour candidate, I still feel he would have lost, to be honest. And I think what we're seeing as well with the performance of the Conservatives as well, the fact that another independent came second, um, an independent came second after George Galloway. It does show that Labour and Tories are being rejected across the board. I've seen people, Labour members, rip up their membership following the response to the Gaza and Israel crisis from Labour as well, and choosing to vote for a party that's not Labour or Tory, they'll vote anyone else. So I think that does reflect on what happened in Rochdale as well. That it was a situation where you might find people that have been, I've been a Labour voter, but look at the response they've given. I'm not going to vote for them, anyone but them. Tories, the same response as well. And in terms of George Galloway appealing to the Muslim ethnic minority vote to win, we also need to recognise that the percentage of Muslims in Rochdale is not as high as the percentage that gave him that win. I've also seen people online also say, I am not Muslim, I am not an ethnic minority, but I still voted for George Galloway. He did manage to, let me just make it clear that I have no respect or support for George Galloway. Let me just make that clear. This is just an analysis of what possibly went on. So while not liking him at all, I think we need to also recognise that what's happened is that people chose what they felt was the least worst option when it comes to mainstream parties, that George Galloway was able to appeal to people outside of the Muslim and ethnic minority communities because they had to recognise what they had. In terms of the voter turnout, I'm sure that a lot of people just chose not to vote instead. There's voter fatigue, voter apathy, and not knowing who to even support as well. So we've got to recognize all those factors, and I think in general what we can conclude is that there was a rejection of mainstream parties, considering what's been going on, in favor of those who are outside the establishment that they want to get rid of.
Thank you, Fatima. So it's again from Labour for Galloway. Younger viewers might not realise that he is formidable and he is fearless, an incredible orator. In 2005, after the invasion of Iraq by the US and the UK, Galloway testified. He was summoned, and he went to the US for a Senate hearing. He was accused of having made financial gains from Saddam Hussein, and he was against sanctions on Iraq and the invasion of Iraq. He claimed Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, as outlined in Tony Blair's dodgy dossier. So he's fiery, and Galloway walked out of that Senate hearing with his head held high, while the Senate probably wanted to have a lie down in a darkened room. So for me, it's kind of listening to him being interviewed after his success in Rochdale, and then finding out about his campaign. I mean, the fact that he was brave enough to talk about the grooming gangs, which is part of Rochdale's recent history. Do you think that kind of fearlessness might have appealed to some voters that are maybe previously apathetic?
Absolutely. So absolutely, I do feel that it might have appealed because he's gone specifically. He's been able to challenge, the contentious, the complicated issues, that are staring people right in the face that maybe mainstream politicians will be afraid will be afraid to give comment on as well. So probably that has resonated well with voters. You know, he's also different from your typical average politician. So that might have also resonated with voters who are looking for a complete change, you know, who don't want the establishment anymore. George Galloway offers something completely different. You know, it's almost like the way we saw the response for Donald Trump when he first came on the scene to be elected as president. So I do feel that George Galloway did appeal to people in that manner, in that way, you know, offering that sort of stuff. And I think uh, so I think also we need to recognise that George Galloway, even in his speech, we need to recognise that he did not refrain from using a lot of dog whistles. To be honest, I did feel that, but what he chose to speak on, what he chose to focus on, was much localised, and he dared basically. So I also feel that watching him in Parliament, I think he is one to watch because he might he might understand that he's not going to be re-elected again, possibly, and he will possibly be his daring self, but make a statement of it, take it up so many notches, knowing that he could probably have a mic drop moment on his way out. He will be the biggest nightmare in Westminster towards the Tories and the Labour Party. So I think he is one to watch. He might make things a bit interesting in there.
I think you're right. I'm sure a lot of MPs and certainly Rishi Sunak will be very apprehensive about George Galloway being back in the chamber simply because of his oratorial skills. I'm intrigued also that the fact that it's the fourth city that he's represented as an MP, and this is his third party in 4 decades. I think previously he was MP in Bradford, where I was working there at the time, so I used to see him out and about. But I think if I was a voter in Rochdale, do you think maybe I should be sort of cautious as to how many times he's changed? He hasn't stayed in one place for very long, it seems.
Yeah, to be honest, I feel that way as well. I get the sense that he's not someone who knows what he wants in terms of a political party. And I think he's better off as an independent. I think that the way he's been changing parties, I think that signals to me that he's better off outside of a mainstream party or any political party, that he's better as an independent because of the way he operates. I don't think he'll ever find a party that's just right for him or even close. And I think you can look at it in two ways. You can look at the fact that he knows someone who knows exactly what he wants as an individual and can't find a political party to match that. But rather than go independent, he's party hopping, and I find that is problematic. And on the other hand, it people might get the sense that he's true to his values, true to his beliefs, and he's willing to actually part ways with the political party based on that value. He will not stay just to try and stay in the ranks or keep the support of the party or for career reasons. But to be honest, I think largely he is. There is a massive career element to what he's doing as well. But I think there are different ways to look at it. But from my personal perspective, I don't think I can ever vote for someone who does that. And I'd only vote for them if they decided to be an independent rather than changing complete parties. Because one thing I cannot respect is someone being elected with a political party apart because a lot of people vote according to political parties and they don't normally vote for individuals, and then see the risk of him switching during his term to another party that I did not vote for. So I cannot trust him on that platform.
Thank you, Fatima. And so Galloway's win precipitated an emergency speech from the Prime Minister. The very next day, he stepped out of number 10, stood in front of the lectern to say that checks notes. He said there was a shocking increase in extremist disruption and criminality. I don't know, let's just maybe... When I watched the speech, I kind of thought there was a smell of gas, as if I was being gaslit to some degree. What did you think when you heard that there was going to be an emergency statement by Sunak? Did you have any idea that it would be about George Galloway's win in Rochdale, sorry.
No, and I think it's really, I'm amazed that a prime minister can stand and call a speech that's quite largely centered on one person. I watched the press conference. I did think he was going to announce a general election, and when I first heard about him doing a conference, and I was amazed at what seemed like a press conference to George Galloway, which, for the record, I did mention that I do not support. Obviously, it seemed very much that Rishi Sunak was making an attempt to dangerously call a democratic election undemocratic because he did not like the result. It felt almost Trumpian, the speech. I felt it was a diversion to distract from the UK government's incompetence as well, in the context of what he was giving the conference on. There was a lot of dog whistling. I do agree, I did feel a bit gaslit to some extent, like you did. There was a lot of pandering to the right wing and right wing policies. So there was a lot of that going on, and from the tone, choice of words that Rishi Sunak was giving and recommended course of actions, I find his speech did everything in the context of things to whip up fear, curtail our freedoms and rights to peaceful protests, which have been something that the Tory government have been trying to do for a while. Through this bill that's going through this bill that went in Parliament, that was the Police Crime and Sentencing Courts Bill. And, he also managed, there was a lot going on in that speech. He also managed to push the anti-immigration policy by threatening people on certain visas with deportation for joining peace protests, which are largely focused on a ceasefire. And in general, I felt Rishi Sunak just used the George Galloway election as an excuse, as a platform to largely push through right-wing policies and politics, and to distract from the government's incompetence in the wake of what's going on.
Thank you, Fatima. So I found a piece where it says Rishi Sunak said that it was beyond alarming. Last night's Rochdale by-election returned a candidate who dismisses the horror of what happened on October 7th, glorifies Hezbollah, and was endorsed by Nick Griffin of the BNP. You're right, there was a lot going on in it. He also kind of made a small reference to the SNP when he said that long-standing parliamentary conventions upended because of safety concerns, which I think is a reference to the Hoyle palaver that when the SNP had their Opposition Day debate. Sunak also kept dropping words like identity and alien all the way through the speech, alien to our way of doing things, using these kinds of sentences. But when you look at Tory policies, you've got the draconian public order bill, the regressive anti-strike laws, and rights to protest and are under threat. Do you think, is Rishi Sunak turning Britain into a police state? And if he is, would Starmer reverse it when he gets in?
So the first part of the question, is he turned? Yeah, absolutely. His speech was authoritarian. It seemed like he wanted to. It seemed draconian as well. And I do not. And the answer to the second part, I do not feel that Starmer will push policies that are any different from Rishi Sunak, because to some extent I felt from Keir Starmer that he's almost trying to compete with the Tories. There's a lot of flip-flopping, there's a lot of backtracking, and any time that happens, the end result is always geared towards policies that are what the Tory politics and policies are. So I do not think that Keir Starmer is going to push through anything different. This speech, he used a situation to promote more draconian and authoritarian policies to be able to push a police state. I mean, he mentioned he did not explicitly state it, but he says something like at the protests, the police, that they'll support the police to do what they need to do. He's saying he'll give them more powers, and even though I'm up here in Scotland and policing is devolved, what he is saying should concern us all, where they're trying to limit important rights and could impact us up here, these peaceful protests. After the speech, Hamza Yusuf said after the speech that peaceful protests are at the heart of our democracy. And I'm glad to see his commitment to ensuring that right is protected, and rejecting Rishi Sunak's attempt to somehow use our police to enforce a police state, a draconian authoritarian police state. And he gave a speech that applies, when he set the narrative and tone of his speech, he was talking about extremist views, he was talking about unrest. He also made reference, I agree with you, that at some point he seem to be up referencing what happened in the comments as well with Hoyle. Um, Rishi Sunak's speech, to me, applies to some members of his party. You know, he has refused to call out hatred in his own party. The past week alone, he has refused to call out Lee Anderson and Suella Braverman's comments as Islamophobic. In general, I thought his speech was quite hypocritical as well.
Thank you, Fatima. We're right at the end of the time allotted for this question, but just quickly, I'm intrigued. I think you, if I'm right, you kind of alluded to the possibility of an early election, general election. I don't know if I'm right in saying that, but what do you think Labour has to do to win Rochdale back at the next general election, whenever it happens?
I think it's too late for Labour to do anything, to be honest, to win. They're so far down a whatever direction they're going in to me, which seems to be a situation where they're almost trying to outdo the Tories and when it comes to right-wing politics and policies. So I'm not going to give them any pointers or any tips on how might win, because their values and views under Keir Starmer is not going to change at all, and that clearly is not something that resonates with Rochdale with the Rochdale electorate. So I don't think they are going to win the next election. You know, a lot of people are speculating that it might be in May, you know, we just don't know just yet. So it's a general election that let me just clarify, general election. So a lot of people don't feel, a lot of people think it might be in May, but, you know, we've been speculating since last year when this election might be, and as we're going through the calendar, it's changed. Some people might think it's going to be in the autumn. We'll just see when Rishi Sunak decides to call it. I don't think he's going to be calling it this week. I could be wrong, but you know, the situation, if you look at the circumstances, they're going to call it when it's right for them, and they're not going to give any other party the heads up, obviously. So I'm not going to speculate so much on when just
Okay.
now.
Thank you, Fatima. Yes, and although I asked about Rochdale, Galloway's an MP, and so it would be part of a general election. But we'll move on
Yeah.
to Emma Caldwell, the murder of Emma Caldwell. Emma was 27 years old when she disappeared back in April 2005. Her body was found 5 weeks later near Biggar in South Lanarkshire. That was 19 years ago. The murderer was found guilty and jailed for at least 36 years. Also this week, there was a report into the murder of Sarah Everard was published, which is basically Mr. Looking for his name here, Mr. Packer, Ian Packer, the murderer, was given the second longest term in Scottish legal history, and Police Constable Assistant Chief Beck Smith apologised directly to Emma and to her family and many other victims, saying they were all let down by policing in 2005. Emma was working as a sex worker at the time she was killed, and Packer denied all charges. It turns out that there are a string of sexual offences that he committed. Fatima, what is needed so that lessons can be learned to change a culture which tolerates violence against women?
It's very sobering stuff, and it's without a doubt alarming on all scales. You know, the scale of violence against women. You know, people in position of power and trust, where women are placing their trust in, end up being victims of these people, and women have a right to feel unsafe. Whether that's in the care of authorities, you know, and because we still do recognize statistics that women will are can be victims, that women are largely victims of violence from people who they either know or trust. So is that concerning thing that we have just here to start? And you know, what is needed so that lessons can be learned to change the culture, which appears to tolerate violence against women. So, like, violence against women is something I do have a bit of academic background on, from an international development perspective. I always say that it's a barrier to effective global development for all. We need to recognise that. to be able to tackle it. You know, it hurts individuals, it hurts families, it hurts communities, it hurts us all, even though it's perpetrated against one person in that given time in that community. And what we need to be working towards is eliminating all forms of violence against women, zero tolerance, no matter who the victim is. You know, some people might, we still have a culture where people are victim blaming because all this person's a sex worker or they shouldn't have. No, violence against women is violence against women, and we should be eliminating all forms of violence against women. So you know, prevention is key, raising awareness and changing attitudes, you know, they're all key, a key part of what should be a multifaceted approach. We can't just tackle it through one lens or just a few lenses. It requires a massive investment and tackling it in different directions, you know. And for examples, you know, we need evidence-based prevention education on consent and healthy relationships. We need to ensure that that's ongoing work, you know, and that needs to be funded in schools, colleges, universities, you know, the learning environment, because education is a key way to tackle this. I know that the Scottish Government have so much work going on supporting or leading on initiatives to target target problem areas and also to support efforts to eradicate violence against women. They have been supporting high profile campaigns such as Just Rose, you know, led by Rape Crisis Scotland, which was a fantastic one that was challenging wider public attitudes, because attitudinal change is something that's really hard to do and it requires long-term ongoing investment. It's a never-ending approach. And, you know, if I look at what the Scottish Government have done, they've passed the Domestic Abuse Scotland Act in 2018, making sure the destructive impact of coercive and controlling behaviour is recognised by law. So I recognise it requires a multifaceted approach that's both legal, educational, you know, attitudinal change, it requires funding, trauma-informed, responsive and preventative services. You know, we need to keep that work going. And to end this, I think it's really important. The source of violence against women, statistically, perpetrators are male and victims are female. And I think what we really need to ensure that's happening is that men are calling out other men who engage in attitudes that promote, tolerate, or condone violence against women. So we need men calling that out. We need men supporting women, because that is a really key factor to be able to ensure that violence against women, the statistics drop massively, and then we continue working towards eradicating it for good.
Thank you, Fatima. So Humza Yousaf, the First Minister, said he's very open to a public inquiry, possibly led by someone outside Scotland, in terms of Emma's murder. But tomorrow, on Monday, the First Minister is going to, and the Education Secretary, Jenny Gilruth, are going to launch a new Scottish Government framework designed to support schools to tackle gender-based violence, which is kind of where you're coming from there. It said that gender-based violence refers to behaviours ranging from name-calling, intimidation and physical violence to sexual harassment and emotional abuse. Is there anything, have you heard anything about tomorrow's event?
Just briefly, and I think they've got the definition right as well. Because even if we look at the UN definition of violence against women, it recognizes everything from something that you might think it's as simple as name calling. You know, it's not just physical, it's even the threat of violence. Not even just the violence itself, the threat of violence, and it requires, and it also tackles, it recognizes that behavior as well, controlling behavior, financial abuse, you know, these are all elements of violence against women. It is a broad definition, and failing to tackle one element that you think is harmless just leads to a wider problem that has disastrous consequences. And violence against women is not just limited to the physical impact, you know, it's limited, it also includes the psychological impact it has on women. It also includes the health impact it has on women as well. So I'm glad to hear that this is what Jenny Gilruth and Humza Yousaf will be looking at in terms of tackling through schools, because as I mentioned in response earlier, education is a key part in doing that, and the funding is required. You need to really speak in schools, colleges, universities, you know, at every level. And it requires a collaborative approach from learners as well in calling out the behaviours and not tolerating them.
Thank you, Fatima. And just you hear the phrase institutional racism used quite a lot, especially in the recent troubles that the Metropolitan Police have had. Do you think could there be such a thing as institutional misogyny? I'm thinking about Police Scotland here, and again going back to Emma's case, to show the scale of the allegations against Police Scotland. Sky News reported that one woman who came forward and was to talk about the murderer, how she had been treated by him. When she went to the police for help, she was arrested for prostitution and put in a cell in the East End of Glasgow after she alleged a serious sex attack by Packer. So when you've got that kind of, you go to the police for help and they lock you up.
No, absolutely. And, I think it also, if I think of the answer I gave earlier, recognizing that happens, I also mentioned that just because someone's a sex worker, it does not mean that we cannot, that they're any less deserving of help at all. I did allude to the fact that it does not matter who the victim is. Violence against women is violence against women. And when you have environments that enable that sort of behavior, that sort of response, it is institutional misogyny. I do believe that exists, there seems where you make where you also have a hierarchy of victims, who's the right victim, who's the wrong victim, that is misogyny in all elements. I would recommend viewers look at what the campaigning and work that Patty Stevenson is doing around this. So Patty Stevenson was a very high profile activist who was arrested at the Sarah Everard vigil, and she won a case against Police Scotland, and part of her claims was the institutional misogyny going on as well. We've seen leaked WhatsApp messages of the Met. Let me qualify that. The Met. So Patty Stevenson has been looking into that. Apologies, I've got Police Scotland stuck in my head. So the Met and Patty Stevenson has also been looking at the sort of messages that have been coming out of their WhatsApp chats as well. We've also seen that the sort of conversations that they have that's just passed off as locker room banter, but it is misogynistic. And what we're seeing, it should not be tolerated. So for anyone who argues that there's institutional misogyny that needs to be addressed, 100% absolutely, I believe that exists. And that also requires attitudinal change. It comes under the bracket of requiring attitudinal change in order to address violence against women.
Thank you, Fatima. So the next item is the National Care Service. This week, the National Care Service bill passed stage 1 in Holyrood. So the National Care Service, let me just maybe try and give you a little bit of background about that. This is an SNP manifesto pledge. The bill will establish a national care service. It would allow ministers to transfer social care responsibility from local authorities to a new national care service. This could include adult and children's services, as well as cover areas such as justice and social work. Scottish ministers will be able to transfer healthcare functions from the NHS to the new National Care Service. So there was a debate yesterday. It couldn't pass to stage 2 until it passed stage 1, so that's what the debate was for in Holyrood. It's been delayed for quite a number of years because there's been a lot of concerns about the delivery of the bill. So it underwent more scrutiny, more evidence gathering by committees, which is the reason why it's taken so long to get to stage 1. MSPs have now decided on the general principles of the bill following a debate in Holyrood on the 29th. So basically, it's still quite nebulous. There's a lot of questions about how it's going to be funded, how it's going to be organised, who's going to be accountable for anything, but there's also a lot about standardisation and across Scotland, because it seems that at the moment, if you are relying on social care, it's a bit of a postcode lottery. Cllr objected at the beginning, but they seem to be coming on board and the actual debate itself, I would say, was quite interesting. I would say that unionist MPs, the Conservative, Lib Dems and Labour, mostly seem to concentrate on problems in Scotland with social care now, which I think tended to support the importance of a national care service. Fatima, again, I've been rambling. Is there anything that, as you're a councillor in Aberdeen, and this is going to be, councillors are going to be involved or affected, how do you think this is going to be received in your workplace?
Yeah. So I'll just clarify because we have two local authorities. We have Aberdeen and we have Aberdeenshire. So I am a councillor with Aberdeenshire, and then we've got the Aberdeen City. So this is my personal opinion, and just how I feel about it. The bill on the outset is going to allow Scottish ministers to transfer social care responsibility from local authorities to a new national service. And I think what worries me is that I'm someone as a councillor, I see the value in giving local authorities more powers to be able to meet the needs of their communities. And what I'm seeing here is such power being taken away from that, because I do believe that when it comes to things like care, looking after the people in your area, I do feel that a localized approach is necessary. So I'm still not, I'm still not there yet with the idea of a national care service, and it requires listening to more debates and to be able to inform a better opinion. But on the outset, I'm not really comfortable with the transfer of powers. I much prefer a more delegated authority to local authorities, and national care service is something that I think should be implemented locally as well. But if you've also got to look at the situation that currently we've got also the NHS. You also mentioned earlier that the NHS currently that it would mean that transfer of powers from the NHS as well to a national care service. So if streamlining the process, if having a dedicated national care service to focus specifically on that could ease the problems that we have, I think that remains to be seen how that actually works in practice. Because I think what worries me is that we have very good theory, but it's just in practice, will it actually work? Will the funding be there? We also need to recognise that we rely on a lot of the funding through the UK government through the burnout formula as well. So I think we need to be really careful about how we approach this, because it is a care service we're speaking about, and we're speaking about removal of complete transfer of powers there. So I think it remains to be seen how that will take shape, and I would certainly have to look at more debates and what's going on in particular. But where Cllr was from the beginning, I think you recognise well that Cllr wasn't really on board at the beginning, and Cllr is the body that represents local authorities nationally as well. So I think it remains to be seen how that really impacts the delivery of the service and what funding we have and what ideas we have there as well.
Thank you, Fatima. Yeah, I think you're right. I think the sticking point for Cllr was that the MSPs agreed that a National Care Service Board would have to be established for the National Care Service to happen. Audit Scotland has asked about where the responsibility for the National Care Service would lie. Would it be with Scottish ministers, or with integration authorities, or with local authorities, as social care does now? And I think it was Marie Todd that was leading the debate. She said that there were 3 significant changes to the bill as it goes through stage 2, or there will be 3 significant changes. That there will be a National Care Service Board established to oversee the delivery across Scotland, but they won't create new local care boards as originally planned. Instead, they'll inform existing integration authorities. Not quite sure what an integration authority is. And the third thing they said is local authorities will retain responsibility for delivery of social work and social care services with no transfer of staff or assets. Does that maybe ease your mind a little bit?
Not yet,
No?
because I think it still comes back to the point that, as I mentioned at the outset, that the bill allows Scottish ministers to transfer social care responsibility from local authorities. It does allow them to do that. So, yeah, I think it just remains to be seen what happens there, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. So the next item is the Scottish budget. On Wednesday, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, will deliver his spring budget. Can the UK afford tax cuts, and does a productivity drive simply mean cuts to public services? So this is. I'd like to talk about the Scottish budget, which was passed in Holyrood earlier this week, Fatima. But I constantly find it amazing that the Scottish budget it has to wait for the Westminster budget to happen before they can do their budget, because they don't know until Jeremy Hunt stands up and tells us what's happening. They don't know how much money they're going to have to work with, and so there's gaps. What's your opinion?
Imagine with our own parliament, democratic elected people, that this is the sort of restriction we faced. To be honest, so it is rather telling in what I widely campaign for constitutionally. So yeah, we've got that as well, and we're also heavily relying on the sort of politics that's coming out of the Tory government, which will affect our budget. Whether they decide to impose, whether they decide on tax cuts, and whether they decide to cut public services, this will all have an impact on the sort of budget that we can actually deliver and implement. And we've also got to recognise that our priorities are completely different from what the UK government have just now under the Tory government. Ours is led by the SNP. Our response to taxes is completely different. Our response to public services and how they're supported is completely different. And we're going to rely on a budget coming out from people who think differently on these areas and are going to alter the budget and give us a budget based on how they think. So, that's going to be really problematic there.
Thank you, Fatima. And just by the way, apologies from me for conflating Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. I'm really sorry about that. But just while I remember to say that. So Shona Robeson, the Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Finance, she presented the budget to Holyrood and it was passed, although it said it's caveated until we find out what Westminster's going to do. That budget, the Holyrood budget, included a freeze on council taxes, which that's the freeze on council taxes was abruptly announced by the First Minister at the conference, SNP conference, his first conference as leader and as First Minister, and that caused a bit of a stir because it hadn't been approved or signed off at the time, and now we've got two Scottish councils, West Dunbartonshire and Inverclyde, say that they're going to renege and they're going to put council taxes up, Inverclyde by 8%. So, yes, forgive me. Oh, I've got my councils wrong. Sorry, what was that?
Argyll and Bute.
Argyll and Bute.
And West Dunbartonshire. Yeah.
And West Dunbartonshire. And Inverclyde.
Sorry, and Inverclyde. Argyll and Bute. Argyll and Bute.
Fatima, so what do you think about the council tax fees? How's it going to be taken up in Aberdeenshire?
Oh, so we've done our budget already, and there's not going to be a rise in council tax. I think we need to recognise, obviously, you were right, it was abruptly announced. It wasn't the ideal situation for us because council tax does have an impact on how we deliver our services as well, the money that's available. And I think the assurance that we were given is that the Scottish Government would be plugging that gap. That would happen if we freeze council tax. So, 5 to 6% of the total allocation, which would see about, I think Aberdeenshire Council getting about 3 million or something from that as well. I'll have to double check the figures. So, we've already passed ours. We've decided that we are not going to hike council tax, and we expect that support to be incoming. It wasn't an ideal situation. No, I did not agree with it. Cllr should have been consulted from the beginning. And I think councils should be free to be able to decide what is actually needed to be what's actually needed to be able to drive the services that we want to implement as well. So as long as that support, that gap is going to be plugged, we can do the council tax freeze. So let's see how the Scottish Government support us in that area. And as for the two councils, Argyll and Bute and Inverclyde council, let's see what happens to them for what they've passed as well, because I think the freeze on council tax that was given, the freeze on council tax was also on the condition, if we freeze council tax, we would get the money, but if we didn't, then we wouldn't get that support from the Scottish government. So it was our choice was conditional. So we'll just see how those two councils, what happens to them as well. I'll just keep a close eye and see.
Thank you, Fatima. And just sticking on the Scottish Government and the fallout from the council tax freeze and with the two councils that are going to raise it against Scottish Government's will, have you seen this bizarre letter that one of them wrote to Michael Gove asking for Michael Gove to step in and ensure that the Scottish Government passes on funding directly to councils? And so it seems that Scottish Labour councillors are going to the Conservative Party in London to ask for help. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen it, but I'm pretty sure I heard rumblings on Twitter that they were. So, so yeah, I've heard rumblings on Twitter about the councils that are actually that have gone for direct intervention at UK government level. So I don't know any more from that, and you're just going to make me want to go and research more.
Yeah. So Wednesday's Westminster budget is the Tories' last chance to pull some financial rabbits out of the UK Treasury hat, and maybe there'll be a vote for the ballot box in a spring election. So I don't know. So is there anything that you want to say about the Scottish budget or the Westminster budget that I haven't given you an opportunity to do?
I think my only worry is that the UK government approach to tackling the cost of living crisis will also affect how the budget, what sort of budget we get as well. And, I don't think we can afford tax cuts, and I don't think we can afford when we can't afford tax cuts, we can't afford public service cuts, and the people that are going to be impacted by that the most are obviously those of us on the lower end of the scale when it comes to what people can afford. So they're obviously going to make decisions that I feel are just going to support them and their cronies. So which means that they might give tax cuts, and which means that they might cut public services because it wouldn't impact them. So I'm just a bit worried in those aspects, what sort of decisions and what sort of response they give in that area, which will impact the sort of budget that we get and whether we can actually get to do what we want to do.
Thank you, Fatima. So I think, yeah, again, thank you for giving us a large part of your weekend. We're pretty much out of time. So that's it for this week's Full Scottish. But before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We've now reached our emergency crowdfunder £10,000 target, thankfully. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. Our focus now moves on to securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. Fatima, just again, sincerely, thank you so much for your patience with me today and for all your thoughts and insights.
It's a pleasure to be on. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll let you get back to the rest of your weekend and to the viewers as well. Thank you for watching.